Okay, Dr. Linda Chalker-Scott from Washington State University. She has a PhD in horticulture from Oregon State University and is a certified ISA arborist and an ASCA consulting arborist, a professor in the Department of Horticulture, and is the urban horticulture specialist at Washington State University. Dr. Chalker-Scott publishes her research in applied plant and soil sciences in scientific articles and extension fact sheets. She has many more accolades, and so with that, welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Marisa. It's really fun to be back. I was supposed to be here in 2020, but COVID came along, and so I missed out, as all of you did. It's fun to see the room so full and know you have a record-breaking audience. This is great. Good for the organization. There is a handout for my talk, and I know that Marisa is going to be handing those out. Keep it because it's got all of my contact information and websites that I'll mention at the end, and then you don't have to worry about trying to figure them out online. Also has most of the notes from the talk and sometimes extra bonus notes. So useful thing to have. Now I've got to figure out how to use this. Well, before I do that, I want to say that my topic today is, really basic tree care, and it's starting from at the nursery, finding healthy plants, finding appropriate plants, getting them properly prepared, and getting them installed, and then giving them the best chance to survive. As you can tell from this picture, even though these are arborvitae, which literally means living tree, most of the arborvitae in this picture are dead. And this is what I want to help you avoid. So what we'll do first of all is just look at tree selection, specifically the argument about native versus non-native plants. And I know probably in a desert community, you may not have this argument as much as I do with people where we have more trees that are native, but there is still this discussion that's worth having. We're going to inspect roots and crowns at the nursery to know exactly what we should be looking for, and maybe more importantly, what we need to avoid. Then I'll talk just really briefly about site preparation, because we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing before we install our trees. I talk about amendments and what happens, and using mulch to kill weeds. Then on tree installation, specifically on preparing roots, and this tends to be a more controversial topic, although it's becoming less controversial over time, and then immediate aftercare. So just kind of soup to nuts in 45 minutes or so. So first thing, and this is what I do. If you're not familiar with me, what I tend to do is myth busting. And so a lot of times I will start off a topic with something in quotations, and that means it's a myth. And so the myth here is that native plants are superior to introduced species if you want to support wildlife. And this is one of our native plants. This is salal, which is a gorgeous native plant in Washington State. It's got aesthetic beauty. It's great habitat. It produces edible fruits for birds. And it's an understory plant, which immediately should give you an alarm bell going off, because one thing that urban areas tend not to have is an overstory. So when they get planted in places like traffic circles or downtown areas where there's no shade, they look like this. It's a native plant, but it's not a very healthy native plant, and it certainly doesn't provide the habitat resources that you would expect a native plant to do. And what we need to remember, and this is a really important point, when you're working with people, whether they're clients, whether you're a master gardener, or you're educating people, there are no plants native to urban areas, period. Urban soils are not natural soils. They have been amended and compacted, and they're nothing like whatever used to be there. Urban areas have a lot more air pollution. They have more droughty issues. They have heat island effects. They have higher light, especially more if you compare them to a treed environment like a forest. They tend to have more salts, whether it's from de-icing salts or from construction. Their soils, as I mentioned, are nothing like what you would have found there originally. And that's when the pests and diseases that are opportunistic have an opportunity to take over and start wreaking havoc on your plants. And especially trees are so important to maintaining kind of a healthy green landscape. So what I did several years ago was go through scientific evidence, looking at the question, are native trees and shrubs better at promoting diversity of wildlife in urban environments? And in 3 short sentences, what was found in this study was that if you have properly selected native non-native trees and shrubs, and by properly, I mean not invasive. They will tolerate urban conditions better than many natives. They will support wildlife, and they enhance biodiversity of urban landscapes. And that's unquestioned when you look at the 140 some papers that I reviewed for this particular topic. So researchers that have looked at biodiversity under these different circumstances have found, that non-native plants can be just as valuable and sometimes more valuable than native plants, especially if native plants won't tolerate your particular urban conditions. This is a really great example, again, from Washington State, is a bee that is a native bumblebee there. It's called the white-bottomed bumblebee. And it was thought to be extinct in Washington State up until about 15 years ago, when an amateur entomologist got this great photo. And it shows the white-bottomed bumblebee, and the entomologists in Washington State were really excited. So they found this and said, we had no idea it was still here, and it's growing on one of our most noxious weeds in the state, Himalayan blackberry. And, oh, sorry. Okay, is that better? Sorry, and I'm too tall for it too. Sorry. So anyway, the fact is though I would never recommend planting invasive noxious weeds, these invasive noxious weeds are supporting wildlife that could no longer rely on a big population of whatever their native plants were for collecting pollen and nectar. So this is what happens, and a lot of people kind of forget that populations of insects and animals and plants, everything that's live, they continue to change. They're not set in stone. They will start to use new resources as resources become available. That's what ecology teaches us. When you have something come into a system, things adapt to use it. So it's not to say, again, that we want to have noxious weeds, but keep in mind that even noxious weeds can be found to be valuable for our native wildlife. So the best advice I can give you when you're choosing plants for a landscape is make sure you have a diverse variety of plants. Species diversity, woody plant to annual to herbaceous perennial diversity. You want a lot of diverse vegetation because different wildlife will use the different types of plants. The second thing is vertical structure. Vertical structure means you have things that are low, medium, and high. And again, that's going to influence and encourage a diverse population of insects and mammals and birds and reptiles and other plants. And that is because they'll have increased food and nesting sites. The nice thing about this is that this greatest biodiversity for wildlife is also really interesting to us aesthetically. So we can create beautiful environments, and the more beautiful they are, with more and more different types of plants and having all this vertical structure, the more attractive they are to wildlife. And that's just a really valuable lesson to remember, is that monocultural things, lawn and cherry trees is not going to have nearly the appeal to wildlife that a more diverse environment will. So if you're interested in this particular topic, the original paper I did was from, I think, 2015 in Arboriculture and Urban Forestry. And then I also created a fact sheet, which is easier to share with clients and other people who would like to just have kind of the nitty gritty nuts and bolts with what should we do. And so it's a short fact sheet based on that longer literature review. And all of these things are available online. And when we get to the end of the talk, I'll talk about those websites. And you'll notice on the back side of your handout, it has all those websites. So you can download this stuff for free. Okay, so you've decided whether you're going to use a mixed palette of native and non-natives. And now you're going to go to the nursery. There's this perception that an expensive plant means it's a high quality plant. And I will show you with photographs that that is not necessarily true. I used to live in Seattle. I don't live there any longer, but many of my pictures come from the most expensive nursery in Seattle. And they have some of the worst plants I've ever seen in my entire career. This is not them. This is actually from Home Depot, big box stores, which tend to neglect their plants a lot because they don't have usually a lot of horticulturists on staff. But I will say you can get really good plants from these big box stores too. You just have to know what to look for. So what we want to do when we're looking at our plants, we want to have plants that have heights appropriate to pot size. We want to have plants that have good taper, and we're talking most about trees, obviously. A visible root flare. They don't have surface roots. They don't have suckers. and they don't have damage and disease. And you'd think that last point is obvious. You'd be surprised how many things you will find in retail nurseries, which are both damaged and diseased. They should have been pulled out long before they got to the retail nursery, but they're not. And the problem is, a lot of times, at least in my state, is that retail nurseries are considered to be kind of these boutique businesses where people kind of buy them and they kind of play because they like plants, but they have no idea what a good quality plant looks like. So they buy things from the production nursery, and they end up having things that really shouldn't even be for sale. So here's some things that I would consider, although, you know, it's never know what you're gonna find inside of a pot. A fairly good ratio of height to container size. In fact, it looks like it can't really tip over very easily. Keep in mind that the more growth you see on the top side means you're also having similar growth occurring in the pot. And so we know the roots are gonna be circling around. And that's just something we have to accept, and we'll deal with that in a few minutes. What we don't want is to see plants that are really putting on a lot of growth in a 1 gallon container. Because those things, they look unstable, and you can kind of figure that inside you're having even more and more root growth circling and circling and circling and becoming woody. Okay, fibrous roots are one thing, woody roots are another thing altogether. So small pots, not great. They don't, you know, you're not going to find a happy root system inside of those pots. But we'll deal with those, because sometimes you don't have a choice. You have a particular type of plant that you need to get, you don't have many choices, you buy them, and then we will deal with what you're going to find inside. You want to see good taper, and this is sometimes really hard to find, isn't it? Because you're not be able to see the root crown. So you want to see that taper, you want to have a visible root crown. If you can see the beginnings of the roots, like in this one, I mean, it's not a great pot, there's a lot of weeds and stuff in it, but it has what looks like, anyway, at this point, to be a decent root system. What you don't want is something like this. It looks like a pole, a utility pole stuck in a pot. You don't know if the root crown is 2 inches below that or 6 inches below that, or at the very bottom of the pot, you have no clue. It's buried too deeply. So you want to be able to see the crown before you make a decision to buy. So whether it's in a container or ball and burlap, peel back the burlap, move the soil around. And this is okay to do because you're not, you know, ruining anything in the pot or the bag of burlap. Just peel it off, see if you can find the root flare, and then assess it. If it's rotten, don't buy it. And you can't see it until you start removing things. You know, if you see rot like this on a tree, you know, before it even comes off the lot, you know that it's not going to survive because it's already got disease. This is the most horrific one I've ever seen, and I found this fairly early in my career. This tree is completely girdled at that point. And it was in this, if you ever want to practice this, just kind of for fun, go to wherever the things on sale are. They've done a lot for a long time. You'll start to find these types of things pretty easily. So I peeled all the burlap off of this because I couldn't figure out why the tree was so wobbly. And the reason is because half of the trunk was missing. And this tree is dead and doesn't know it. It's still taking up water, but there's nothing getting to the roots because the phloem's all gone, right, at that point. So the tree's busy manufacturing sugars, which are traveling down the trunk, and then they stop because the phloem elements are now gone. So the trunk gets wider, but the roots are going to starve to death, and then the whole tree will die. If you see surface roots, you've got problems underground. Anything that shows surface roots like this means that it was in a smaller pot too long. Some point ago, the roots were not corrected when it was potted up, and you're going to have a mess to either correct or, more likely in this case, just avoid buying altogether. If you have suckers on a species that doesn't normally have multiple stems, that often is a sign of stress. And so if you're looking at a whole bunch of trees like the ash trees and one of them has these suckers, you've got a problem underground. And you can kind of tell with that picture anyway, because then you can see some surface roots too. And so what the tree is doing in this case is it's got an impaired root system. It's not able to get water up to the leaves effectively anymore. It's creating a new crown that's shorter. And so it's bonsaiing itself. That's what happens when roots are restricted. There's another one. So you can see looking at all those trees, none of them have suckers except one. Avoid those plants because they have problems. This one I'd noticed because it had a huge scar on it. And then I looked a little bit closer. Not only did it have the scar, it also had some nice disease where you had a graft that didn't take very well. It should never have been on the lot. And this is from a very high, this isn't from a Seattle nursery, it's from actually one down in Puyallup where I work. And I don't know how it ended up in the lot. I mean, it's such an obvious thing. Anybody could see this. But it really behooves you to spend a little bit of time on your hands and knees looking around the pot and the root flare and all that type of stuff, because you don't know what's going to be inside, but this can give you a good indication of things that you would want to avoid regardless of what's inside the pot. Then you're going to look at the crown, and you want to have a crown that has a strong central leader. You want to have branches that are well distributed along the trunk. And that means even young trees that have those little short spindly branches, those are important. You don't want anything that's been improperly pruned. And this can happen either in the production nursery, sometimes the retail nursery. It should not have multiple leaders unless it's natural for that particular species, and some do. And you don't want to see any evidence of inclusion of bark. So strong central leader, good example of one even in a big pot. So this is actually a pretty decent looking tree for the nursery that I was at. Here's one that does have good branch distribution. You can see all the little branches there. And homeowners tend not to like these very much. And it's up to us to educate homeowners and other clients about why those branches are so important. And they're important for feeding the trunk, and they're important for shading and protecting that really young bark. But unfortunately, what homeowners want to see is something like this, which looks more like an adult tree. And in all these points, all with little arrows, those are all the places where branches have been removed. And now that trunk area is exposed to the elements, it's exposed to weed whackers, it's exposed to all kinds of damage in the trunk tissue. That bark is very young, very fragile, and now it's going to be easily become scarred either by the elements or by mechanical damage. So you don't want those types of trees. This is what can happen in a retail nursery. Okay, so again, trying to make short little trees that appeal to homeowners with small yards, and this is in Seattle at the high-end nursery that I was telling you about. They have topped all of these Japanese maples. And you can see the garbage can right there. They've just gone along and topped them so they look like little short trees. And unfortunately, these are things that will never regain a normal form unless you're correctively pruning them, and so they can regain that form. They will just sprout all kinds of epicormic shoots and multiple branches behind those cut points, and they're going to be hideous trees. This tree, as you can see, is $115, and this was many years ago, and it's been butchered. It had all of its tops cut, and it's certainly not worth $115. Can't think of any other word except for poodling for these trees. And you've seen them, all the lower branches stripped off, and then everything's kind of clustered at the top to make these little balls. And you can see with the picture on the right what it looks like when you get that regrowth. And so you just have this knot of tissue that really needs to be cut and managed and got back into a normal form, or you're going to have problems down the road as the tree gets older. Oftentimes trees are headed to encourage a more columnar form. So instead of finding trees that are naturally columnar, a lot of people try to create trees that will be more columnar, like this oak tree. And you can see it's been topped twice with a new leader established. So it's really rather ugly in the first place. And now you've got all these competing uprights that are going to lead to problems later on. So those are things to avoid in terms of the nursery. Hopefully you'll find some things that will pass the test. And as I said, with the things that have root issues, we'll deal with that in just a minute. So site preparation, we're told work in organic matter before planting landscape plants. And the problem is that we are taking agricultural science where we're planting monocultures of plants and we're removing all the vegetation from the soil every year. And then you do have to bring organic matter back. You work it in the soil. That's agricultural. If you have a home vegetable garden, you might do that somewhat, but then there's also plants in the home vegetable garden that are perennials, and you're not, kind of tearing them out and putting them back in. And in a landscape, you certainly aren't tearing all the vegetation out. So you really can't do this because you're mimicking conditions for a land use that it's not appropriate for. If you're growing annual crops, you can work organic matter in every year. If you're doing a landscape, you can do things one time and you can't work them in again. So what we have to realize is and I know this is kind of small, so I apologize for that. There's differences among different systems that we use land for. And so you look along the top there, we have intensive agriculture, home vegetable garden, and ornamental landscapes. And so ornamental landscapes is obviously where we're talking. And what I want you to notice is that for the system goal, what our ultimate goal is for all of these systems is, in one case, to maximize yield of crops. And then in case of ornamental landscapes, we're trying to sustain a permanent landscape. Those are two completely different system goals, and they have to be managed completely differently. So we can't use agricultural science for growing crops to manage landscapes. Look at soil disturbance. High soil disturbance for annual crops makes sense because you're planting something every year. In an ornamental landscape, you have very low disturbance because you're not taking things out, you're planting things once in a while, but pretty much it's kind of a sustained system where there's not a lot of disturbance. So the whole mantra to work organic matter into the soil really doesn't fit managing an ornamental landscape. If you do this, again, you can only do it once, you will have problems down the road, including disruption of hydrology, where you have standing water, where you have soil subsidence, where everything settles as the organic matter breaks down, and nutrient overload, where you have too much of a good thing and you've got way more nutrients than you need because you've used a lot of compost and supplements and things like that. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but this is a great diagram to show what happens when you amend a soil. So this was from some research done back in the 1950s at my university by some soil scientists, and they have two different soil types there. So the top is a silt loam, so a finely textured soil sitting on top of a layer of sand. And then they were dripping water with that Erlenmeyer flask on top, and you can see the water's moving through the system both vertically and horizontally, right? When it gets to the interface between those two soil types, it stops moving, which always blows people away. Because my mindset and everybody else's mindset, before they really look at how the mechanics of water movement work, would think, okay, where you're getting to a sandy soil, it's very permeable, the water's just going to run right through it. It does not. It stops moving because the texture is so different. The water doesn't move easily into the new texture. So it goes sideways. And it will continue to go sideways until it's so super saturated that finally the water forces through into that next layer. But that's a perched water table. So whenever you amend a soil and you haven't done anything to the underlying soil, that's an abrupt layer, and your water will get to that point, it will stop moving, and you will have standing water on the landscape. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is subsidence. If you amend a soil and put in more organic matter than its natural climate is going to produce for it, and we'll talk about that in just a second, that organic matter will decompose readily, and it's not replaced naturally. So what happens, organic matter goes away, all the inorganic settles, and you get subsidence. So you can see that the red line on top is where the soil originally was, and over time it sank, leaving a root ball perched on top of its little island, because that's clay, and it didn't decompose. So you want to avoid that. And then the third thing is the whole thing with how much organic matter is sustainable. It's different depending on where you live. Your levels of organic material in most of the areas that you're from are pretty low if you're from a desert environment. Where I'm from, they're a lot higher. And so there's no perfect amount for any soil. I mean, generally speaking, there's no perfect amount. Every system is different. And what you have to look at is the natural additions, which is death of soil organisms, as well as natural incorporation from the surface of the soil. Natural subtractions, which is decomposition by microbes, as well as uptake by plants. And so that's how you plus and minus in terms of organic matter. The difference there is what's sustainable for that soil. And it is going to vary from site to site. So even though I was taught, and you may have been taught, that this perfect organic matter percentage is 5 to 10%, not true. Soil scientists don't say that anymore either. It's true when you're doing research and you're finding out when you're growing things in containers, what plants do the best in, and that's between 5 and 10%. Containers are not your site. So you have to find out for your site what's natural. The easiest way to do that is to get soil samples from an area that is not managed and is under natural conditions, and find out what that organic matter is, and that's what's going to be sustainable for wherever it is that you live. So We've talked now about improper soil management. Let's see why else trees can fail. And I mentioned poor quality roots. Well, you can't see this until you actually get into the root ball. And if you have something that's in a pot it hasn't been properly potted up, or it's been in that pot too long, you're going to have a circling woody mass, right? And that's what they're going to look like. And they are not going to straighten out miraculously when they get planted, because they're wood. They're not fibrous. They are in that form, and they will continue to grow in that form until the tree fails, and they will fail. So this particular cedar failed within a week of being planted. And the only reason this whole row of cedars even lasted was because in the nursery, it's kind of like an ICU, right? There's always water and care and everything else. Once you've got it planted out and they're competing with other things for water, I mean, these trees all died all in a row, all within a week. If you have circling roots in a container like this, they're going to continue to do that in the landscape. They will not straighten out. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. They think that somehow they're just going to start growing outwards. Well, new roots might, but these circling roots will stay there, and they will continue to circle and get bigger and bigger until the tree fails. And this is completely avoidable. You can see here that what happened was, you can see that circling root there, the big gray thing, and it kept the trunk from expanding, creating kind of a fulcrum point, right? And then it just fell over one summer. Completely windless day, and it just fell because it was no longer balanced. And that's just what happens if you have a circling, girdling root in a landscape. So we have to fix those things. Okay, let's look at how we prepare roots, and or not, more likely not prepare roots. And unfortunately, the popular way to put things in the landscape where I'm from is what I call pop and drop. Do people do pop and drop here? Pop them out of the pot, drop them in a hole? Okay, it's great when you are penciling out your bottom line in your installation company. It's not great for tree survival. Okay, we've got stuff that's in media, soilless media, being dropped into a soil that's whatever it is. And remember I mentioned about hydrology and water moving between different textures? Doesn't move. So you're creating these little areas where you've got a porous media, it's all full of roots, surrounded by something else. Water doesn't move. If water doesn't move, roots don't move. And they're everywhere. These ones even haven't, still in their bag, and they've all been hidden handily with mulch. So next time you think the volcano mulch is killing a tree, pull the volcano mulch away and see what you see. Because mulch gets blamed for a lot of things that are actually poor planting practices. But you can see this, when things aren't corrected and prepared properly, roots aren't going to survive that. They have to get through all these barriers to reach the native soil. So this is just, unfortunately, a really common practice, and it's a big reason trees fail within the first few years. You'll see in that picture there, you can have a few roots that are coming out and exploring past the ball, but this is a clay ball in a sandy soil, and it's just not going anywhere. And then finally, things are installed too deeply. So if you have trees in the nursery, again, good reason to avoid things that are planted that are too deep in the pot. And I actually was behind a customer at a nursery who was buying a plant in a container that was planted too deeply. And the customer didn't know anything about it being too deep, but they asked the staff person who was checking them out, how do I plant this? At what level do I plant it? They said, make sure it's at the same level it is in the pot. And, it's common advice. So they're planted too deeply in the landscape because people are told that's the way they should plant trees. What happens in the long run is that then you have chronic drought stress because you have an impaired root system that's too deep, that can't get oxygen, it's not going to grow well. And then you're going to see drought stress in the leaves every single year. So these trees are from a whole line of street trees in Richland, Washington, which is southeast corner of the state. It's hot in the summer, hot and dry, and cold in the winter. So in the spring, these trees all look great. They send out leaves, they're nice and green and happy. And then in the summer, like clockwork, as soon as the temperatures get into the 90s and 100s, all the leaves die. So you can see here that the landscape there, you can see it's watered, it's irrigated, the grass is green. But what happened was that this tree was planted too deeply, about 18 inches too deep. So all of those roots that you see there are adventitious roots that have developed after the tree was planted in order to make a new root system, because the old root system is too deep. And what installers don't think about is that roots need oxygen, and oxygen is not 18 inches into the soil. It's used up before it can get that deep. So the original roots die, the new roots are growing out, and they're enough so in the springtime, when it's cool and moist, enough water can be taken up to flush the leaves out. They do fine. But once summer comes and the evaporation pressure is much greater, then these roots can't keep up, because that's not a decent root system. That's just a really spindly, secondary root system. And because the leaves die early on, the tree doesn't make enough food to store over the winter to make a better root system. And so you just have this chronic problem every single year. Again, completely avoidable had it been planted at grade. So what I propose and recommend strongly, based on research, is that we want to use what we know about plant sciences, what we know about soil sciences, and do something to improve transplant success. And so I call this take it all off. We want to take everything off the roots, because our goal is to get the roots in touch with a site soil. That's the goal. And the best way to do that is to take off everything that's preventing that from happening. So the basket, the wire, the burlap, the twine, the media, everything goes. And then the roots are in the soil, which is what we want. And keep in mind that container plants and ball and burlaps are new, relatively speaking. They've only been around for less than 100 years. Before that, all we planted was bare root trees. And those are the trees that are still around. The things that are dying are things that are younger. And the ones that are planted bare root got established, and they still do well. So you can have a system like this one up there in the right-hand corner, all circling. Some major structural roots are circling. They need to be pruned off. Sometimes you're lucky, like when this ginkgo tree on the bottom, where it has a beautiful root system. It's ready to go. So this is from a demonstration that a colleague and I did for ISA back in 2007, where we wanted to show arborists what kinds of things they'll find if they take it all off. So we went to the nursery, we got this gorgeous looking tree in terms of its crown health, nice new burlap, took off the old burlap, the new burlap, and inside there was a basket, and there was twine, and there was old burlap. And so I've started calling this the regifted tree, because it was left on the lot for an extra season. So they wrapped it up in new burlap, so it looked like it was just freshly dug, and it fooled us. And we're both arborists, So this was great. This is what you see underneath the burlap. So before we did this, we took some duct tape and we put it around where the burlap actually was on the trunk, so people could see. And that was the result. 10 inches below grade. And had they been planted like that, it would have failed eventually. Who knows how long? But we took everything off. As you can see, there's one scar there that you can see, and that was because it was one of those not J roots, but kind of what I call an angle root. It goes straight out and straight down with 90-degree angle. Just cut that off. All the rest of the roots look great. Planted at grade, and it's where it should be. But we wouldn't have known where grade was had we not taken everything off. And you'll see what happened with this tree in a bit. This is one of the trees that I did for myself, because if I'm going to practice what I preach, I'm obviously going to do it myself. And this was our first one. This is a red bud. As you can see, it has a fairly contorted root system, a lot of roots going down and under. Some of them are going around, and they like spokes on a wheel. And those ones that were going down and under, I took off. And so I took off roughly 75% of the root system. And this is a huge change in behavior. It's scary. It was scary for me to do it the first time, because even though theoretically I knew it was the right thing to do, there wasn't a whole lot of science supporting it. And so my husband was gleefully photographing all this, because he was convinced that the tree was going to die because I'd taken off all of its roots, which was great. So if you do this, what you're doing is you're taking off all the barriers, roots, soil. You can correct roots if they're bad, and sometimes they're really bad, and you'll be planting at grade. And when you prune roots, just like when you prune the crown, it enhances new root growth. So we all know when you crown prune, you get new branch growth right below those cuts. You prune roots, same thing happens. So all of this leads to root establishment at a much greater rate than if you leave them intact. So what I want people to think about is planting roots and not clay root balls. We don't need to throw big balls of clay into the soil. There's absolutely no point doing that. Plus, it's a lot of work, you know, the backhoe and everything, you know, to dig up for big trees to get a hole, plus carrying those things around. If you bare root a B&B tree, I can carry it with one hand. You know, you don't have to have equipment moving it around. So what I call this with the bare roots is planting kind of hand in glove. Okay, so that's, you know, the roots getting into the soil as opposed to planting a ball, which is like ball and socket. Think about this when we're thinking about staking. And if you have a hand in the glove, it's pretty tight. And a socket moves around. And that's the reason we do a lot of staking, is because we've planted a ball in a hole. So this type of root system is a hand and glove root system, because when you're mudding this in, which we'll get to, the tree is going to be much more stable because all the soil is being washed around all those little fingers and holding the tree in place, as opposed to a ball and socket, which does not establish and moves around and has to be staked so it looks like it's going to get established. And this, I think, is the best example I can show you. That's my husband, who's become a fan of bare rooting things and loves to find bad planting. So this was one that he found. As you can see from the side pictures, that's what it looked like. It had 11 different ties, I think, because, I mean, look at that thing. It's a horrible tree. It's got a circling root system, and the next year it was gone. It wasn't from us doing this. It was because it failed. So this is what you want to avoid, because you just have to go back and replace it. And the nice thing is, once you take the stuff off, it's easy, because you've got a bare root system. You can see the flare. You know how to dig the hole. Don't have to dig the hole until you get the roots exposed. And then you just want to arrange the roots like spokes on a wheel. If they're fibrous, if they're woody, you want to cut them until they look like spokes on a wheel. You don't want anything going down and around or under or anything like that. You want them all to be going out, because new root growth is away from the trunk. It's going to go away looking for water, oxygen, and nutrients. So it'll always be away. It won't circle naturally. So then you just mud in, which is actually an old rose grower's term. And because roses are often planted bare root, and mudding in just means that you dig your hole, you put your plant in, you add soil and water until you actually have water standing. That looks like a big muddy soup. And then as the water drains away, and you can even do this yourself as you have your hand in there or something. As water drains away, you'll feel the soil tightening around your hand, because it's just glomming on as the water drains out. And this is what happens and helps stabilize that tree. This isn't to say you never have to stake the tree, but if you live in an area where you don't have directional winds, you oftentimes, and most of the time in our area, don't have to stake at all, because the water and the soil have stabilized the roots, and you don't have to worry about staking. So with those pictures I showed you, we'll get to those, but I want to show you what Bartlett Trees have been doing in North Carolina at their labs. So they've been curious about this whole thing too, and doing a very long-term experiment, which is getting to the point where it's like, okay, it's long-term enough, you need to publish results. But what they did is they took a whole bunch of trees, equal numbers of corrected and uncorrected, and they planted them. So uncorrected means that they were actually planted bare root, but they were left uncorrected. So they had circling roots. And you can see in this picture here that you've got some good circling going on. And then they corrected some, cutting the ones that were circling. And so those are two trees. One is uncorrected and the other one is corrected, and they've been digging them up and looking at the root structure over time. But I want you to notice from this, by looking at the diameters of the trunks, is they're pretty much the same, aren't they? This means that even though it's a shock to the tree to do substantial root cutting, that even over time, over a few years, that it catches up to the uncorrected tree and eventually will overtake the uncorrected tree, because it has better ability to expand its root system out rather than putting growth into these circling systems. So bare root trees always will do better. It just takes them a little bit longer, because things can stay alive in a bag for a while, but after a while, they're going to fail. So here's the red bud that I did. So that was before pruning. And that one is after, about 75%. And here it is on site. So you can see it against the fence. I did that on purpose. So you can kind of gauge the fence with where the tree is. I did this in April, which is not a great time to plant, but you know, sometimes you have to plant bad times. It was in flower, which is not great for the flowers. The next day the flowers were black because of course I'd cut off the majority of the roots. And it sat there for 3 months and then it leafed out. So when you're trying to read your tree, when you see it leafing out, it's telling you it has a substantial established root system. Okay, you're not going to cut the crown at all during transplant. You're just going to leave it. It's going to stay dormant until there's enough of a root system to support leaf bud break. So here it is in July, breaking bud long after it's supposed to, but it's fine. There it is a year later, year after that, year after that. It's surrounded by arborvitae. And you know how competitive they are for water. Didn't matter. This thing just took off because its roots were in the soil and it was well mulched and we kept it irrigated. And so you can compare it there. This tree at that point was just at the fence height. And on this last picture, the tree is about 3 times the height of the fence in a landscape that's heavily competitive in terms of other established trees. But again, with water and mulch and with roots that can establish readily, not a problem. Here's the one that we did that was 10 inches below grade. And there it is 3 years later. Now, well, there it is 3 years later, sorry. So what I want you to see is that it was a fairly unmaintained park. They put mulch down, they don't irrigate. So within 3 years, it was a beautiful tree without requiring any other additions of anything, except, as I said, the park always mulches around their trees. The best thing I ever saw in terms of comparison was from some photos that were sent to me by a master gardener actually in Vancouver, BC. And she'd heard one of these talks that I'd done on why it's important to take all the stuff off your trees. And the the willows that were planted in a park across the street from where she lived were all starting to fail, as you can tell with this picture here. Oops. And then, pushing buttons too early. You can tell that it was not washed because you can see the clay, you can see the wire basket burlaps under there somewhere too. And one of these trees finally died. And so the tree crews came out and replaced it. And I'm not quite sure how she did this. I wish I had her magic, but she managed to convince the tree crew, maybe she gave them beer or something, I don't know, to take everything off the tree. And they did. And that's the replacement tree. Okay, so that looks like a maple, that looks like a willow tree. None of them look like maple trees, but that looks like a willow tree. And here they are in context. So the 2 that are in the foreground are 2 of the original trees. The third one down, which is casting that shadow, is a younger tree that was planted after one of the original ones died. It's a huge difference in terms of tree establishment and survival, just to get all that stuff off the roots. And it works anywhere. Because a woody plant is a woody plant, it's going to react the same way to this treatment, regardless of where you live. So finally, everything's planted properly. If you have to stake, you stake. If you don't have to stake, don't do it. So it shouldn't be a routine. It should be, if necessary, at a stake. Regardless, remove it after a year. I remove them after 3 months because by 3 months, they're established where I live. And anything that you're thinking right now, boy, I've got a tree that wiggles a lot. You know, the wiggle test will tell you if your tree is established. Dig it up and plant it again. Take everything off, plant it right. If it's still alive, you've got a chance for it to take the second time around. Unfortunately, what happens when things are planted all in socket is you end up having something like this, where you have stakes that are tied very tightly to the tree because it's not moving. I mean, because it's not standing up on its own, so it has to be held in place. And now what's happening in terms of how trees work is the tree is supported. So it's not going to develop a whole bunch of taper and girth in its trunk because it doesn't need to, because it's already supported. This is the same way trees in a forest that are in the middle act. they're really tall and skinny because the wind isn't bothering them. So they tend to be very tall and skinny. The ones on the outside edge are shorter and thicker in terms of their trunks. So what this tree is doing makes people feel really good because it has lots of leaves. The crown looks great. It's got this skinny little trunk. And you know what happens when people take the stakes off is they snap, because now they've got this huge crown and no trunk to support them. And I've seen many, many examples of that. If, on the other hand, things are left on too long, which it always happens, it seems like with public, green spaces, is that there's never money in the budget for maintenance. So the staking material stays on. And this one happened to be one where I had just moved to Seattle, and this was at one of these expensive mall parking lots. And I saw that, and after taking pictures, I went to my car and I got my wire cutters. And I went through the entire parking lot. Crazy woman cutting these things. And Seattle's a really friendly place, and everyone's kind of like, look what she's doing, but no one was like after me or anything, but everyone just kind of stood back and let me be crazy with my sharp tools. And trees are all still alive. They have scars, but they're all still alive. So that was it's been over 7 years, can't hold me responsible for it anymore. So, but that's what happens. And you lose a lot of trees that way too. So it's really simple. It's not expensive. It requires a lot of, looking at plants in the nursery, thoughts about what will do best in terms of the goals of your landscape, properly preparing the soil by not amending it, properly preparing roots so that they can establish easily. Don't fall for any of the things that you're supposed to add, all the supplements and other stuff. The only things you need are mulch and water. And those are the miracle products. So with that, I have time for questions and would be happy to answer any. And I think there's microphones up here in case you want to come up, or maybe people will bring the microphone to you. Oh, and I was going to mention too, and I'll actually give my websites later on my second talk today, but on the back sheet is all my different websites that have a lot of free downloads and information and good stuff. And there's your magic number that you need.
I have a question.
Yes.
I think everything you're saying is pretty much totally against the whole nursery industry and business model. And it's also, as working arborist, it's the only place we get trees. And I think we're all aware of the issues on both sides. And I'm curious what you kind of see as maybe some sort of path forward. Because by the time we get it, we don't have many options. We just get it.
What my colleagues and I have actually, we've worked on this for decades. And what we have suggested when you're speccing out trees and things is that part of what you write into your specs is that when trees are delivered on site, that you will destructively sample like 1%. In other words, you're going to take it apart and you're going to look at the roots. And if they're not acceptable, you're sending them back. Now, as far as I know, no one's ever done that. It's too bad, because that's how you get beyond it. That's how you finally force the production nurseries to produce, better trees. Unfortunately, it's really just assembly line. It's how fast can you get stuff out of the liner into a small pot. There's no thought about root systems or anything like that. It's just assembly line work, oftentimes by people that really don't understand root physiology at all. So that's unfortunate. So one way to get around that, again, is to have in your specs that you're going to reject things that don't have good roots. If it doesn't happen, the second best thing you can do if you're doing installations is to do, what I recommend, which is just take everything off and correct things. It takes more time, but you save more money. So I've talked to a couple different people who own their own small installation companies. Both of them were very skeptical of this, but had clients that wanted to try it. And both of them told me that they have gone completely to this method of installation, because what happens is that the replacement costs, when things die in less than a year, are virtually zero. So they actually save money, even though they take more time in terms of preparing the plants. They save more in terms of money by not having to go out and replace things over and over and over. So it works out money wise if people are willing to take that, make that change. But I think you're right, it's well established. And I think right now we're just, and you see this all the time with these million tree planting things. It just almost makes me ill watching those, because that 990,000 are going to die. So that's all I can say. So sorry, I don't have a really great answer. Sure. It's a good question. So you can do this anytime you want. Ideally, you do it when it's dormant. Ideally, that would be late fall, because that gives the roots a chance to establish over the winter, because roots never go dormant. They will continue to grow as long as it's not freezing, as long as the soil is not frozen. But I did mine in April, and that wasn't ideal, and it still did great. Now, if you do it when they've already leafed out, you will lose the leaves, but they will come back. Worst case scenario, they won't come back until the next year. But as long as the roots are maintained and are healthy and getting water and nutrients and all that good stuff, you will have full crown growth the next year.
Yeah. That we start to take away some ability to pick up moisture, then we're gonna have habitation.
Oh, you won't have cavitation. No, what happens is you just have reduced water uptake initially, and that's why I say it's best to do it. And this is true anywhere. The best time to do it is when there's no demand by the crown of the tree for water. Well, with little demand. With evergreens, of course, you're going to have a little bit of demand all year round. But if you're talking about deciduous things, the demand is virtually nothing. And during that time, all the resources of the tree are going to root growth anyway. So ideally, you plant in the fall when the leaves are already gone. You can, as I said, you can do it anytime, and it works with anything. And the trees that, large trees have been moved and transplanted in full leaf before, and they do just fine. And this is in any climate. So you just have to be aware of the water relation thing. And if you have to do it in full leaf, just be aware that you're going to have to really, really watch both water and make sure it's well mulched. If you can put up shade cloth or something like that, that helps too. Anything that will help keep evaporation rates down. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Abundance to do that, because I was taught originally that we do wall crack, and we had the wall crack, they pulled it out, you can for that more than likely the trees would have died. So if I'm doing this purposely, am I going to get good results with evergreen? I totally understand the deciduous, but the evergreen, I have concerns about that, especially with larger diameter plants.
Yeah, and I was taught the same thing when I was doing my PhD, that you don't touch the root ball, because if you mess with it, it'll collapse and the tree will die. And it's just not true. But evergreens do have that extra danger because of the fact that they're continuing transpiring. I would always suggest doing it, again, during the dormant season, because even though they're transpiring, they're not actively growing. So you're going to always have some water loss, but not as much as you would have during the growing season. I've transplanted many evergreen species, both broadleaf and normal, and I've never had any particular type of tree fail. The only tree I ever had fail was one where the root system was literally a cube, because it had been in a liner pot and there was no way to deconstruct it. And so I just cut the entire root off, and yeah, it died. So yeah, if you have no roots, it will die. But as I said, we've planted numerous evergreens before and have not had a problem with them. What usually happens is when you have reduced water at the root level, stomates will close immediately in leaves, and so your transpiration loss is going to be nothing. And so they'll just sit there and keep their stomates pretty much closed until there's enough water that's being taken up, because you'll get new fine root growth immediately after things are installed. I mean, by the next day, you're going to have fine roots that are developing, and that's going to get, water relations back up. As soon as there's enough water to start moving up the xylem again, then the stomates will open to pull the water up And I mean, that's how it's really regulated. So if there's enough water stomates, it'll be open, not enough water stomates are closed. Sure. Sure.
Thank you. What's going through my head and where I might practice something like this is when we have a container tree that is so heavy and hard to move. Would this be a possibility, getting it out of the container, getting a garden hose and spraying all the dirt off of those roots and transporting the tree and then doing what you're talking about?
That's a great question. And the answer is absolutely. And it gives me a chance to talk about what the city of Spokane, Washington did. And so I have a colleague named Jim Flott. I don't know if any of you know Jim, but he goes around and does demonstrations on root washing all the time. So Spokane's on the east side of Washington. So it's a hot, dry climate. It's more like here. It's hot, dry, and it's cold in the winter. And they have sandy soils. And they're bringing in all these clay root balls, and their survival rate was below 50% of their street trees. So Jim started doing exactly this. He gets the containers or the B&B, gets everything off, puts them in big tubs, lets them soak, or as you say, you can do it with a garden hose until the clay sloughs off. Or if it's a container plant, until you get all the media or most of the media worked out, you can leave them in the water for quite a long time. And then when you're ready to take them somewhere else, what they did is they had a single truck rather than multiple trucks with great big containers and, you know, root balls that took out the trees, and they covered the root systems with wet burlap that was left over from taking all the burlap off of the trees. And then they were able to get them all planted within a day because they didn't have to dig giant holes. So yes, short answer is you can absolutely do that. Wrap it up to keep the roots cool and moist, move them to where you need to move them.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is, have you ever tried this process on bushes?
Yes. Then I'm on any woody plant you can do this to. So any shrub, any vine, any tree.
Okay, it goes against everything, but
Absolutely does.
yeah, I don't know how many guys.
I was taught all this stuff too. Because the level of our knowledge about woody plants, especially in a more, you know, like arboriculture, horticultural field, was really pretty limited back in the 80s when I was getting my PhD. And it's really sped up in the last couple of decades. But we all learned a lot, especially people my age, learn things completely differently. Yeah. And the science has kind of got us to move past that. Is that good? Yeah. I will be around, so